Hello class, this is Professor Edler. Welcome to Lecture 1. Lecture 1 covers Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877. This is the period politically, socially, culturally that comes right after the American Civil War. Now, before we get into Reconstruction itself, we have to take a step back and go to the middle to ending part of the American Civil War. If you look at the Emancipation Proclamation, this is really kind of the beginning of what we consider Reconstruction. And even though the war is going to go on for another 2 years plus, this is really the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Now, I want to be clear that the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of people think that this is what ended slavery. If that's what you believe, that is a misconception. This was a military order that Lincoln put in September of 1862 that only dealt with states that were in open rebellion. And these states had to either give up by January 1st, 1863, or all of their slaves would be freed. This was kind of a blackmail situation, kind of a way of the Confederacy being forced to come back into the Union and ending the war early. It would not compensate any of the slave owners. So if it went into effect, the slave owners would lose all of their slaves without any kind of government compensation. It also did not stop slavery in territories that were still loyal. Now, that's an important thing to remember because there are southern states or border states, as they were called, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and even parts of Louisiana that were under Union control by January of 1863. These states did not have that provision go into effect. They would be allowed to keep their slaves. It also did not make former slaves, ex-slaves, or freedmen citizens. So the Emancipation Proclamation is not going to grant any citizenship rights to members of the country, people who were living in the country that were ex-slaves. So just because you were freed and the Emancipation Proclamation is now into effect, it did not give you the right to vote, hold office. It gave you no such rights. It only freed you in the states that were in open rebellion from your position as being a slave. Now, the first major Reconstruction plan was thought out by President Lincoln in December of 1863. And today we know this as Lincoln's 10% plan. Now, what Lincoln wanted to do is he wanted to make Reconstruction as easy as possible. He understood that these were Americans, and if we were ever going to get back on proper footing as a country, that we were going to have to resign ourselves to the fact that, and I say us, being a northerner, some of you are southerners, and I apologize, that you were going to have to, as northerners, be lenient on the southern states, that we could not punish them too severely, or they would struggle and continue the fight. So what Lincoln proposed is once 10% of the secessionist population, those people who were eligible to vote in 1860, who voted for secession, once 10% of those people took an oath of allegiance to the United States, and they agreed to abide by emancipation, the South would be restored to the Union. Voters would be allowed to elect delegates to start creating new state constitutions. They'd create new state governments. All Southerners would be granted a full presidential pardon, except for high-ranking Confederate military and government officials, people like the generals like Robert E. Lee and the President Jefferson Davis would not be given automatic pardons at this time. That would wait till later. All Southern property, except for slaves, would be guaranteed. No plantation houses would be taken away. Livestock would be taken away. The only thing that would be forfeited, of course, would be the slave property. Now, while Lincoln was at the height of his power here in 1863, 1864, and no one could really match him politically, there were some people in the government that felt that Lincoln did not go far enough. And in the House of Representatives, you had a group of people called the Radical Republicans. There was also a group in the Senate that we'll touch on in a minute. And these people felt that Lincoln was being too lenient, that we needed to punish the South, that the South must be completely reformed, society had to be erased and completely redone to wipe away the stink of slavery. And you had people like James A. Garfield, who would eventually become President of the United States, John Bingham, Henry W. Davis, and probably the most famous at this time, Thaddeus Stevens. Now, Thaddeus Stevens is the one that came up with the idea of 40 acres and a mule, which never passed. It never went into effect. But he was the guy that actually proposed the idea of land and livestock redistribution for former slaves. In the Senate, you had Charles Sumner. Some of you may remember him from history, the first half of U.S. history. He was the one, of course, that was beaten with the cane by the Southerner in the U.S. Senate chamber. You had Zachariah Chandler, Benjamin Wade, and James H. Lane. These are all going to be the leaders of the radical Republicans in the U.S. Senate. The members of the House and Senate that were radical Republicans proposed an alternative to the 10% plan, as we call it today. And theirs was called the Wade-Davis Bill, and it was passed through both houses in July of 1864. And what they said was that 10% was too lenient, that we were being too nice to the Confederacy. So their counterproposal was that in order to re-enter the Union, a majority of the population, 51%, had to swear an oath that they had never supported the Confederacy. Now, this is a problem because in order to secede from the Union, the Confederate States required a 51% vote supporting secession. So this could never take place because 51% of the population had not supported the Union and now are being asked to swear that they had never supported the Confederacy. So this was not a real Reconstruction plan. It was nothing that was ever even seriously considered by President Lincoln. And they sent this to the president's desk a few days before the House and the Senate was set to go on recess. And Lincoln used what's called a pocket veto. Essentially, he refused to sign it. The president has 10 days to sign it before it goes back to the House and the Senate, and they can override him. But because there was less than 10 days, they went into recess before the expiration date occurred, and Lincoln was able to just veto it that way. So Lincoln got the upper hand when it came to the radical Republicans and essentially said, I am the President of the United States, I have the wartime powers, and it will be me who leads Reconstruction. And for the purpose of the course, for those people who are not really that familiar with how the government works and constitutional law works, again, I'll go over what a pocket veto is. As I said before, when the president does not sign a bill within the mandatory 10-day period, Congress is not in session to accept the bill's return and vote to override the presidential veto, to approve it without presidential signature, the bill cannot become law. It's the same as if the president vetoed it, signed a veto order. This happens very rarely today because Congress really never goes out of session, and even if they do, they can call themselves back into session and vote on it. But this was back in a day when the President of the United States was really in charge of when the Congress came into session. He could send them home. He could call them in. And so Lincoln wasn't going to call them back into session. He essentially said, go home. I'll deal with this. And then as soon as he did, of course, he didn't sign it. So that's what a pocket veto is for those people who are confused. It's kind of something we don't see very often today. So, you know, it's understandable if you've never heard of it before or it was something that you were unsure of. Here in 1864, this is a presidential election year. Abraham Lincoln is going to run for re-election, and he isn't even renominated by his party. Now, Lincoln had won election in 1860 as a Republican, but in 1864, the Republican Party declined to renominate him, and instead they nominated former Senator John C. Fremont. Fremont had actually been the first Republican Party nominee in 1856 who ran against James Buchanan. He was defeated in that election. He then went on to be a senator, and he would lead the Republican fight for the presidency. The Democrats nominate former General George McClellan. He had been Lincoln's top commander in the early parts of the American Civil War, and later Lincoln fired him for inaction. Lincoln himself decided he was going to run on a Union ticket. And for the next 4 years, the party, the Republican Party that we now call the Grand Old Party, will be absorbed into this new organization called the National Union Party. And what Lincoln will do is he will run as a Republican, but he will choose a Southern loyal Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson. And he will say that I'm running on a National Union ticket, a union of North and South, Democrat, Republican, and our goal is to essentially restore the Union. That's it. Once the Union's restored, we'll take care of all the other stuff later. The rest of it's just, in essence, nonsense at this point. The most important thing is preserving the Union. Now, in the early stages, it was thought that Lincoln was going to lose this election. Polls were not good. He barely won the election to begin with in 1860. It was a matter of North versus South, 4 politicians running against each other. No one thought in early 1864 that Lincoln had a chance. Most people thought that it was going to be John C. Fremont that was going to win the election because he was going to win most of the northern states. And if you look at the color red, where Lincoln ends up winning here in 1864, these are all northern states. These are states that were loyal to the Union. So you know that the Democrat is not going to win many of these. It's going to end up being the Republican. But the question is, who is the real Republican? Well, a few things happened for Lincoln. First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation is proved to be very popular by many people in the American electorate. Second, the win at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863, and the fact that the Union seems to be on the cusp of winning the war, will actually boost Lincoln's chances for re-election. So in mid-spring of 1864, John C. Fremont decides to drop out of the presidential election, setting up essentially a two-man race again between Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan. Now, the map says that he is running as a Republican. That's because we still consider him to be a Republican. But remember that that is actually the National Union Party that we're talking about here. So he is going to have a Democrat as his running mate. Now, what ends up happening is he wins the election in the popular vote very well. If you look at it, he gets 55% of the popular vote versus 45% for McClellan. And if you look at McClellan, when it comes to the electoral vote, he's destroyed. He gets Lincoln gets 91% of the electoral vote. He gets 212 electoral votes. McClellan only gets 9%. He gets 21. And even more shocking is he only wins 3 states: Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey, which isn't a surprise because that's his home state. Now, what would have happened if the Union had been restored? Well, it probably would have been much closer in the Electoral College. He probably would have, McClellan would have won the popular vote. Lincoln probably still would have won the electoral vote, but it would have been much closer. And if you also look, one interesting thing about this is this is going to be the first real election that the American West is really going to play a pivotal role. California had actually voted in the previous election, but now you have Nevada and Oregon that will also have a role in this, and also West Virginia. Don't forget West Virginia is a new state voting for the first time here in 1864, even though it had been part of Virginia since the founding of America. This is really the first time that it's going to be involved in electoral politics. Prior to winning re-election, Lincoln began thinking about the future of the Union if he won. And one thing that worried him was that he wouldn't win re-election. So in secret, he decided that what he would do is if he lost the election, remember the election's the beginning of November, he wouldn't have to leave office until March of 1865. What he decided to do was fight as hard as he could to end the war before McClellan took office, and then turn over a restored Union to McClellan to rebuild. Of course, that didn't happen, but one of the things that he did start toying with while he was running and was actually introduced in the U.S. Senate in the spring of 1864 was the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, it was not passed until the following year. It would be passed after he was elected, re-elected to a second term. It was passed in January of 1865, and it won't be ratified and go into effect until after Lincoln is dead. Remember, Lincoln is assassinated in April of 1865, and this will not go into effect until December of 1865. But the 13th Amendment will be what finally ends slavery in the United States. So when you think of the question, what ended slavery, it's not the Emancipation Proclamation, it's the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That is what ends slavery. This was a very highly debated issue. If you look at the Senate, it actually was passed in the Senate very quickly. Lincoln had a lot of allies in the U.S. Senate. The House was much harder. It took a lot of legwork. If you've ever seen the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, it goes into that quite extensively. And, this was not a very popular thing for Lincoln to be pushing, and he was pushing it during the election year. Yet it did actually work very, very well with the American people. The American people were very happy with this. And so when it was finally adopted and ratified in 1865, Lincoln is going to be given a lot of credit for this. Amongst the black population, even today, he's still referred to as the Great Emancipator. Lincoln is reelected, of course. His second inauguration happens on March 4th, 1865. Remember, prior to the 1936 election, inauguration day was March 4th. Lincoln gives his speech essentially outlining what Reconstruction is going to be like. He says the famous phrase, "with malice towards none and charity for all." Lincoln has a dream of rebuilding the Union quickly and getting on to the work of America. And Lincoln is at the height of his power. He's also really feeling good about himself. There's only a month left in the war. Lee is very close to surrendering. He'll be surrendered within a month. The Confederacy will fall in a few weeks. The capital of Richmond will surrender to Union forces. And Lincoln is beginning to not only think about his future as a politician, but also his future as a citizen. He's beginning to talk about what's going to happen after his second term is over in 1869. He's starting to talk about possibly traveling the world, give speeches. He had always wanted to go to Europe, and him and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, are really looking forward to rebuilding the country and then going off on their own and kind of finding their way. Now, what's interesting about this speech is if you look on the balcony, on the right, if you're facing it like I am, on the right-hand side, but on Lincoln's left-hand side, up there on the balcony, is a young actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth, very famous in the Washington, D.C. scene. Booth was a Southern sympathizer, and him and a group of his friends had decided that they wanted the war to go on as long as possible. And they had a goal of kidnapping Lincoln and essentially forcing the Union to give up Southern prisoners of war, trade Lincoln for prisoners of war to rebuild the Confederate Army and continue the war. Now, this was never reasonable. The South is at the verge of collapse financially. They don't have the resources, militarily or civilian, to keep a war going. And a few weeks after Lincoln gives this speech, this second inaugural speech, he's visiting a Union troop hospital, a military hospital. And he begins talking about maybe giving black former slaves the right to vote. And when Booth hears this, he says he is a dead man. Giving the Negro the right to vote has just signed his death warrant. So Lincoln goes from being the target of kidnapping to the target of assassination. And that brings us to the sad events of April 14th, April 15th, 1865, and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. If you see the picture here on the PowerPoint display, this is actually Ford's Theater. It's still around today. It's now a museum. They still have plays there on occasion. It's an interesting place. If you ever get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., I highly recommend it. It's part of a complex. Across the street is the Peterson House, where Lincoln will end up dying. I highly recommend it. It's very interesting. They still do plays there. They still do a play on April 14th. They do the play that Lincoln was attending when he was shot and killed. There's a historical tour there. There's even a ghost tour, which is really kind of cool. I've been to it many times. But this is what it would have looked like in 1864, 1865 time period. Now, people talk about all the time how the president ages during his time in office. And I really hate talking about this because most of the time it's really not consequential. Presidents serve 8 years. Most presidents get reelected. They serve almost a decade in office. And let's be honest, we all change quite a bit over the period of 10 years. President Obama, for one, our current president, announced that he was running for president. I believe it was in spring of 2007. And he wasn't even elected until 2008, became president in 2009. He'll be serving a full 8 years, God willing, as long as he makes it. You never know what's going to happen. But he will serve 8 years in office. That's about a decade. And so you can see the gray hairs coming and things like that. It's normal. It's normal. I mean, 10 years ago, I wasn't as filled with gray hair and looking as old and ragged as I do now, even at 36. But if you look at Lincoln, you can definitely tell a difference in the man. Between December of 1860, when he was still president-elect, before the southern states had all seceded from the Union, and in February of 1865, just a few months before his assassination. Lincoln had never been in the greatest health from what we have heard. There's all different speculations and ideas as to what he may have had. Some people say he may have had something called acromegalia, which is giganticism. We've heard Marfan syndrome. We've heard all kinds of different, even tumors, that he wasn't going to live anyway. The stress of the office and the fact that he was a wartime president definitely affected him. Lincoln was not that old, by the way. If you look at the picture of him, in 1865, he's only in his mid-50s at this point. And yet you can see the toll of the war on his face. Lincoln was a troubled person. He also suffered from, we believe, what is now depression, clinical depression. At that time, they called it melancholy or being blue, having the blues. But we believe he had what would now be depression. Let's be honest, who wouldn't suffer from depression being the president during a time of war and, of course, losing multiple children? Remember, he had multiple children die very young. So Lincoln has had a rough time of it. And now the war is over, and he's looking for some time to relax. This is the most famous picture of John Wilkes Booth, an up-close picture for those people who have never seen a picture of him, don't know what he looks like. Booth was considered to be, I know this is hard for some of you to believe, but he was one of the most famous actors in the country, if not the world at that time. He was considered to be an 1860s sex symbol. He was from a family of actors. His father was an actor. At least one of his brothers that I can remember was an actor. He was a Shakespearean actor. He also did comedies. So he was very well known, was able to walk around Washington, D.C. without being, being suspicious at all. He was able to go into Ford's Theater that night. No one suspected anything. He was an actor on that stage many times before. And so no one even thought about Booth going into the theater that night. No one even assumed that he had any malicious intent. This is a picture of the single-shot Derringer that Booth would use to shoot President Lincoln in the back of the head. It is part of the, I believe it's at the Ford's Theater Museum right now. It is owned by the National Archives, and so it does travel around quite a bit. I saw it years ago, and maybe it was 20 years ago. I saw it at Ford's Theater, but it may be in the Smithsonian today. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but this was a single-shot Derringer. So he only has one shot at this, so to speak. So he's going to have to be very careful and make sure that he doesn't miss and make sure that nothing goes wrong with this assassination attempt. Booth will wait out in the hallway. He'll see the bodyguards go down to the bar. When there's a moment of the play where there's a lot of action on the stage, he will creep into the presidential box. He'll get the door so that it won't be able to be opened from the outside. He'll sneak up on the president, and in a moment of applause and laughter, he points the gun at the back of the president's head and fires point-blank range. The guy on the far left is Major Rathbone. That was him and his fiancée, Clara Harris, are invited guests of the Lincolns that night. Ulysses S. Grant was actually supposed to go, but interesting story, Mrs. Grant absolutely hated Mrs. Lincoln, so she refused the offer, and so the Rathbones went instead. Major Rathbone was engaged to Miss Harris, Clara Harris. Harris was a daughter of a member of the bureaucracy, and so she was well known within Washington, D.C. social circles. Rathbone stands up to defend the president. Booth will slash him across the arm with a large knife, cutting him down to the bone. There's a doctor that will have to come up and check on Lincoln, but regardless of what happens in 1865 medicine, Lincoln is mortally wounded. Now, interesting note, Major Rathbone is haunted by this for the rest of his life, and sadly, he does go insane. He actually kills his wife at that time, who is Clara Harris. He ends up marrying her. He then kills her in a fit of insanity and spends the rest of his life in an insane asylum. To be fair, so does Mrs. Lincoln. She spends times in and out of an insane asylum the rest of her life. This is such a traumatic event, sitting next to her husband when he is. This is the presidential box, the presidential balcony at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. today. It is decorated exactly as it would have been in 1865 in honor of President Lincoln. You could go there today and see it, and it's still as it was at that time. Here's another view of the presidential box. This is actually taken from the stage. You can see the picture of George Washington, the American flags draped, and of course the two American flags there on each side of the balcony. This would have been exactly, as I said in the previous slide, as it was in 1864, 1865. The only difference, of course, let me be clear, is if you look at the lighting today, the lighting has been replaced. It's all electrical today. Back in those days, it would have been illuminated by oil. Some of it would have also been candlelight, but a lot of it would have been oil. And if you look to the right, there's a modern speaker system. That would, of course, not been there in 1865 as well. The first person on the scene was a U.S. Army surgeon by the name of Charles Leal. He had been attending the play. The play was called Our American Cousin. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. He was attending the play with some friends. He was the first doctor to attend Lincoln and realized very early on that the wound was mortal. So he then asked for Lincoln to be moved somewhere where he could recover, or at least not recover, but be treated in some kind of comfort. And they were afraid to take him back to the White House. They were pretty sure that he would die on the way back. Washington, D.C. at that time was still fairly wild. It hadn't been really... it had been a city for about 60 years or so. The roads were still kind of swampy. Most of the roads were cobblestone at best. And they were worried that the trip from Ford's Theater to the White House would kill him. So instead, they decided to take him across the street to a boarding house owned by the Petersons. This is the Petersons' boarding house as it would have been seen in 1864, 1865. Very simple, 3.5-story row house in downtown Washington, D.C. And this is the Petersons' boarding house today. It is a museum, as I was saying before. You can go to it and tour it. You can see the room that Lincoln died in. It's a museum to not only his death, but also his life. So if you ever get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., and you decide to go to Ford's Theater, make sure you go across the street and see Peterson's boarding house. It is worth the trip. Being the President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces, does have its perks. Lincoln being shot, his advisors call in the U.S. Army Surgeon General to come in. His name is Major General Joseph Barnes. He comes in, he reassesses what Charles Leal looked at and realizes that Leal is correct. The president's wound is mortal. He will not recover. Now, today, it's interesting, but most likely Lincoln would have recovered from his injury. We don't know to the extent he would have had any kind of permanent brain damage, but with modern medicine, it's most likely that Lincoln would have survived this assassination attempt. Now, that is totally different than the Kennedy assassination. Most people will argue that Kennedy could have survived. Kennedy never had a chance, unfortunately, if you look at the damage that was done to him. But most of the damage that was done to Lincoln was It was bad, but a lot more damage was done by Leal and Barnes later on, and the rest of the medical staff because of their limited knowledge on the brain and how to do medical procedures. So, in another place, in another time, President Lincoln may have survived. He may have been brain damaged. Possibly, he would have recovered enough to walk and talk. But he may have recovered in modern day, but in 1865, his wound is mortal. He will not recover, and he does not regain consciousness at all. From the moment he is shot until the moment he dies, he is essentially in a coma. This is a lithograph of the room as Lincoln is laying dying. One thing to note, Lincoln was a very, very tall man for his age. I can't remember the exact height, but I think he was 6'4" or 6'6", somewhere in there. This was a time when most men were 5'6", 5'7". So Lincoln was so tall, they had to lay him across the bed diagonally for him to fit comfortably. Lincoln was kept in the room for a few hours. He went in right before midnight, and he would die early morning, right around sunrise. One of the things that was famously said at the time of his passing was by the guy who was in the far left-hand corner. That was his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Supposedly, Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages." That's disputed. There are other people who said that he actually said, "Now he belongs to the angels." It's still a debate. They still fight over that today. But regardless, Lincoln does become the first president of the United States to die from an assassin's bullet. He's not the first president to die. That we've had a couple. We had William Henry Harrison, who died in 1841, sadly after only serving about a month in office. And you had also Zachary Taylor, who died. I believe he was about a year and a half, 2 years into his term at that point. But Lincoln is the first president to be assassinated. Unfortunately, he won't be the last, but he is the first. Here is a picture of the Peterson boarding house today, with some of the Lincoln paraphernalia. They have redone the room as it was on April 14th, April 15th, 1865. Immediately upon his death, Vice President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee becomes President of the United States. But what happens is Secretary of War Stanton is concerned that where is this plot going? Is Johnson in on the plot? Was this all designed to make him president? We do know now that Johnson was actually a target of the assassination. It just so happens that he didn't show up home in time, and the assassin, just kind of gave up. Secretary of State William Seward was attacked in his home and nearly killed. So this was a long ranging plot, and Stanton is concerned how far this goes. And so he immediately puts out a reward for John Wilkes Booth and the other conspirators. And, he wants them living or dead. And the largest manhunt in U.S. history at that time will begin for Booth and his accomplices. This is the map of John Wilkes Booth's travel out of the city of Washington. He shot Lincoln at 10:15 p.m. on April 14th, 1865, and immediately left the town. Very quickly, he went through the state of Maryland. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was that after he shot Lincoln, he jumped off the balcony and landed wrong on his feet and broke his leg. So he had to stop at the home of a doctor that he knew in Maryland, Dr. Mudd. And that'll probably be one of the most expensive, at least for Dr. Mudd, free doctor clinics he ever did. Mudd will end up serving a fairly long prison sentence for aiding and abetting John Wilkes Booth that night. You can see that he did escape. He was not captured and killed until April 26th, 1865. The man who shot him was a guy by the name of John Corbett. They were told they wanted him alive if necessary. He took a lucky shot. He shot Booth in the neck. It would paralyze him, and he would be with it long enough to talk to his captors for a few minutes, and then ended up dying. On the right is the house. I think it's called Garrett's Farm, if I remember correctly. He was actually in the barn behind the house, hiding out. Lincoln's funeral will be the first major state occasion, state funeral, that will involve the entire United States. Prior to becoming president, he did a countrywide tour as president-elect. And so the funeral commission decided that they would reenact a lot of that travel for his funeral. And this is the opening stages. This is him laying in state at the White House. Here's another more famous picture of Lincoln. This is actually a picture of him, the dead body. It's famous. It's in many, many history textbooks. He has the honor guard standing there, 2 Union soldiers standing over his body. This is the funeral procession for President Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865. It is the largest parade in Washington, D.C. history at that time. Now, that won't last long, because in a few weeks, you will have the final parade of the Union Army that will go down the streets of Washington, D.C. Every battalion, every corps of the U.S. Army will march past the Presidential Reviewing Stand. And I believe today that is still the largest parade in Washington, D.C. history per people marching. But you can see that this was a large turnout for the president. He was heavily mourned in the North. Many people saw him as a martyr to the cause of abolition, anti-slavery. Even the Southerners, who saw Lincoln as an enemy, realized that this was a huge mistake, that this was going to cost them dearly, because now, without Lincoln, the question is, what is Reconstruction going to look like? No one knew. Everyone kind of knew what Lincoln was thinking about, what he was planning on doing. But now that Lincoln's dead, no one's 100% sure how exactly Reconstruction is going to look. This is the old Nashville. This is the funeral train that will take Lincoln home. It takes him from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. It backtracks the entire route that Lincoln took as president-elect coming to Washington, D.C. It'll stop in many major cities, including Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New York City. One of the most famous pictures I've seen is when his parade is coming down New York, a street in New York City. There's actually a picture of a building with 2 little kids sitting in one of the windows watching. One of those children is the future President Theodore Roosevelt. Was able to be witness to the parade, the funeral parade for President Lincoln. Lincoln's successor is Andrew Johnson. Johnson will be president for almost all of Lincoln's second term. He is president from April 15th, 1865 until March 4th, 1869. Johnson was born in North Carolina but lived most of his life in Tennessee, and he was a loyal Democrat during the Civil War, a loyal Southerner. He was a lifelong Democrat, was a Democrat from the time he entered politics in 1830 all the way till the time he died in 1875. The only time he wasn't a Democrat was when he was part of that National Union ticket from 1864 to 69, but still actually a Democrat in all but name only. He has a long political military career. He was a U.S. representative from Tennessee from 1843 to 53. He was governor of Tennessee from 1853 to 57. During the Civil War, he was actually the military governor of Tennessee, a political position, from 1862 to 65. He was then chosen to run with Lincoln in the election of 1864, where he was elected and served for about a month as Vice President of the United States. Then he was president from 1865 to 69, and then right before he died, he was actually reappointed to the U.S. Senate. As a member from the state of Tennessee. He only served a few months before he died, but it was kind of seen as a return for Johnson, a repudiation of all the bad things that happened to him when he was president of the United States. Now Johnson, even though he supported Lincoln's platform, he felt that maybe Lincoln was being in some ways too lenient and in some ways too harsh. And so he decides to create his own Reconstruction plan in 1865, and today we now call this presidential Reconstruction. Some of the parts of this are that the Southern states must declare secession null and void. So from now on, they cannot argue that they have the right to secede from the Union. They cannot leave the Union voluntarily. From now on, the Union is perpetual. It's forever. He also said that the Southern states would not have the right to request money for war debt. The U.S. government would not reimburse the South at all for any of the debts that they incurred while part of the Confederacy. They would either have to default on that money or they would have to come up with a way of paying for it themselves. The Northern states would be repaid for war debts, so any money that the Union incurred in operating the war would have to be paid back by the South at some point. Southern citizens would be forced to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States in order to regain their rights. This was not like Lincoln had said, just 10%. Every Southerner would have to swear an oath of loyalty in order for them to get their individual personal rights back. So it was a case-by-case basis. Finally, those people who had been members of the Confederate government, high-ranking military officials, and those people who owned more than $20,000 in property, aka slaves, would be barred from government participation. Now, one thing interesting to remember about President Johnson is he was not a wealthy man. Even though he was a Southerner from Tennessee, he was not a wealthy man. Therefore, he did not own slaves, and he didn't mind punishing the Southern slave owners for their ownership of slaves. Now, what happens is Johnson declares Reconstruction over in December of 1865. He says that all the Southern states have fulfilled their requirements, that Reconstruction's over, the country is restored, and he begins allowing the Southern states to seat delegates to the U.S. House of Representatives and to the U.S. Senate. The only problem is, when it comes time here in January and February of 1866, in order to bring in the new congressmen, guess what? It's all former Confederate generals, Confederate politicians, and Congress says, no, not going to happen. So Congress has the right to disqualify members. They disqualify all the Southern delegations. and they start their own Reconstruction plan, which we call Congressional Reconstruction. First, they required the ratification of the 13th Amendment of all Southern states. They also will require in time the ratification of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which we will talk about later. It's not a request. It's not a suggestion. In order for the Southern states to return to the Union, they must ratify these three amendments. They also say that federal courts had the right to vacate any unlawful state court conviction and sentence. What the Southern states were doing is, now that blacks were freed, they were setting up special courts, trying them, and putting them in jail. So now what the federal courts will do is vacate all these state court decisions that were trying to reinstitute slavery as a prison culture. It'll also split the Southern states into 5 military districts. Each of these districts will be under the supervision of a U.S. Army officer, mainly a general, and there will be martial law, meaning the military will run the government of each of these military districts. Educated blacks will be given the right to vote and allowed to participate in the government process. This was done mainly to embarrass the Southerners. Now, all of a sudden, the freed slaves go from being property to being in control of their government. So this is not a happy thing for the Southerners. Finally, all ex-Confederate officials and military officers are barred from the government, with no timetable for their rights to be restored. And actually, sadly, Robert E. Lee will die before his rights are restored. He asked for a presidential pardon, and his paperwork got lost and wasn't done until after he died. This is a map showing the 5 military districts of the South after the Civil War. As you can see, Texas and Louisiana are District 5. District 4 is Mississippi and Arkansas. District 3 is Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. District 2 is North and South Carolina. And District 1 is Virginia. The 14th Amendment, which had been in process for quite a while, was finally ratified and adopted in 1868. Now, a lot of people are confused by what the 14th Amendment did, and here's the exact wording on the screen, but I don't want you to really worry about the wording. I'll kind of explain it to you in better detail, but the wording's on the screen if you want to read it for yourself. Essentially, what it says is that all persons that are born or naturalized in the United States, subject to the laws and provisions of the United States Constitution, are citizens of the U.S. and in the state in which they reside. So that is essentially giving slaves citizenship rights, because remember, they were born in the United States or naturalized here, but they were considered property. So a lot of the Southern states said, well, you know, you can't give them you can't give them citizenship rights because they're not citizens. Well, the 14th Amendment says if you are born here or naturalized, you are a citizen. Okay, it also says that no state can make laws that take away citizenship rights unless you commit some kind of crime. You have to have due process. You have to be convicted in order to lose your citizenship rights. Okay. It also says that representation will now be done counting everyone as a whole person. No more will African American population be considered 3/5 for taxation and representation. This is the first major voting rights change in American history since the founding of the U.S. Constitution. The only people who will not have this citizenship right, the right to participate in the vote is those who participated in the rebellion, aka the Civil War. It also says that no person can serve in Congress or in the executive branch, be a member of the civil or military hierarchy, that had previously taken an oath to support the United States and then engage in insurrection or rebellion. Essentially, anybody who left the U.S. Army or left the U.S. House or Senate to join the Confederacy would lose their right to serve in government. Also, public debt of the United States would be paid, but none of the southern states would have their debt paid. This is a very important thing. We talk about it all the time about whether the government should default on their debt. It actually spells out here in Section 4 that the public debt must be paid. The only time it can't be paid is in the case of insurrection or rebellion against the United States. And of course, that is, no longer admissible because the Confederate States have been defeated. By this point in 1867, 1868, President Johnson is tired of the fact that Congress is overstepping what he considered to be their authority, and he's going to begin to push back on them. The main holdover from the Lincoln administration was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton was a radical Republican, and he spent most of his time blocking President Johnson's military orders regarding Reconstruction. Now, let me be clear that this was totally illegal. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces. We are still within a time of war. The war has not been officially declared over. The states have not been reintroduced into the Union. So Johnson still is Commander-in-Chief. Stanton is essentially what we now call the Secretary of Defense. At that time, it was Secretary of War. And he just flat out refuses to follow the president's orders. The president tells him to do something, he tells him no and does what he wants. So in August of 1867, President Johnson fires Edwin Stanton as the Secretary of War and replaces him with General Lorenzo Thomas until the Senate could vote on a replacement. Now, the Senate's not going to be happy with this because Edwin Stanton is a radical Republican, the Senate is controlled by radical Republicans, and the House of Representatives at this point is controlled by radical Republicans. So in January of 1867, the Senate returns from their recess. They vote not to remove Stanton from office. Again, this is kind of iffy whether this is even constitutional. The U.S. Constitution says that the Senate must advise and consent on the appointment of a presidential nomination, but it doesn't say anywhere that they have the right to oppose someone being fired. And so this is seen even today by constitutional scholars as being unconstitutional. They then turn around and pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And it says that since the President of the United States must get congressional advice and consent on a cabinet appointment, they also must get advice and consent to remove a cabinet official. Now again, the Constitution is real clear on this. The President of the United States must get congressional advice and consent to make an appointment, but nowhere does it say that the President of the United States has to get approval to remove someone. As a matter of fact, it's clearly defined today as the person serves at the pleasure of the President of the United States. So this act here is designed to go after Johnson. It is totally illegal. It's unconstitutional, and eventually the courts will overturn it and say you can't do this. Johnson falls right for the trap. I mean, this is a trap. They're trying to get rid of him, and he doesn't figure it out. And instead of reinstating Stanton, he refuses, and he tries to appoint Ulysses S. Grant as Secretary of War. Grant refuses the nomination, saying that, he has other ambitions, and of course we'll find out in a little bit what those ambitions will be. But Johnson's caught in a web. He can't get rid of Stanton, but he can't bring Stanton back either, or it completely takes away the appointment powers of the President of the United States. So here in 1868, President Johnson becomes the first president of the United States to face impeachment charges. Now, a lot of people misunderstand what impeachment is. People say, oh, the president's going to be impeached. Well, just because the president's impeached doesn't mean anything. Impeachment is bringing up charges, and that is done by the House of Representatives. It's actually the Senate that will sit there and actually judge and decide whether the president is innocent or guilty. And in order to be removed from office, it has to be because of a high crime or misdemeanor. And this is a lithograph of the articles of impeachment being voted on in the U.S. House of Representatives chambers. In February of 1868, the House of Representatives came down with 11 articles of impeachment against President Johnson. On March 2nd, they approved the articles of impeachment and sent them to the U.S. Senate. The Senate would begin the trial of President Johnson on March 5th, 1868. Johnson was accused of committing high crimes and misdemeanors against the U.S. government, and the trial would be presided over by Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase. Chase is an appointee of President Abraham Lincoln. Well, it's a little confusing. So the Senate votes 35 members guilty, 19 not guilty, okay? And this is done on May 26, 1868. So 35 of them say that he's guilty, 19 say not guilty or non-guilty. But the reality of it is, in order to convict and remove an officer of the federal government, you have to have a 2/3 majority. That's 36 votes. So even though 35 said guilty and 19 said not guilty, since it did not become 36 votes, he was actually considered not guilty. He was acquitted. And Johnson will remain president of the United States. By the way, one of the guys that voted in the 19 was considered to be the 36th vote. He changed his vote at the last minute, said that this was political, that it had nothing to do with high crimes or misdemeanors, and they ruined his political career. He did what was right, and they ruined his career for it. It takes him 20 years to really get back. Johnson seems to have won. Okay? He forces Stanton to resign as Secretary of War in May of 1868. He replaces him with John Schofield on June 1st, 1868. But even though this looks like a win for Johnson, it not only destroys his presidency, but it destroys the power of the President of the United States for the next 30 years. Okay? From essentially 1868 until 1900, the President of the United States will not be the leading official here in the U.S. It will be Congress. Congress will be supreme. The President will be subservient to Congress. Okay? So if you look at the presidents from 1869 until 1901, with the introduction of Theodore Roosevelt as president, they are all considered to be fairly weak presidents in the scheme of the early Republic period and modern day. This is the actual articles of impeachment that were approved by the U.S. House of Representatives. You can see it. It's even in the National Archives. But this is a picture I got from somewhere, maybe Wikipedia. I don't remember. This is a picture of the articles of impeachment. You can see the yeas versus the nays, the yeses versus the nos to approve the articles of impeachment. Remember, it didn't pass in the Senate, therefore it didn't work, but this is the signatures from the House being sent to the Senate to hold the trial. In 1868, we're going to have a presidential election. President Johnson is too politically damaged to run for a second term. He toys with it for a minute, and at the end of the day, the Democratic Party thanks him for his service, but tells him, you will not get the nomination, and they nominate the former New York Governor Horatio Seymour for president. The Republican Party will nominate General Ulysses S. Grant, who had been the commanding general of the U.S. Army during the American Civil War. Everyone knows that this is essentially a shoo-in for Grant. I mean, he is the war hero, the first major war hero since President Washington, since President maybe Jackson, if you want to go to Andrew Jackson being a major war hero. Really, on the scale of things, Grant is essentially the reincarnation of George Washington when it comes to a political figure. He should win this election very, very easily. And so he does. If you look at Grant, he gets only 53% of the popular vote versus 47% for Seymour. But if you look at the electoral vote, he gets 214. He gets 73% of the electoral vote. Seymour only gets 80 electoral votes, 27%. And if you look, it's because he wins a majority of northern states, although he does lose New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky. He also loses Oregon. But look at two states he loses that should be surprising. That shouldn't be surprising. He loses Louisiana and Georgia, right? Those are southern states. You know they don't normally vote Republican at this time. But look at Arkansas, Tennessee, North and South Carolina, and Florida. That's interesting. They're red. In 1868, not 1968, what happens is these southern states are still under Reconstruction governments. So radical Republicans control those states, not the traditional Democratic Party. Georgia and Louisiana have been returned to Democratic, essentially to elected governments. So you can see where the electorate may have chosen for Seymour there. If you look at Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia, the reason they're green, and I apologize if that's not green, I'm sort of colorblind, but it looks green to me. If you look at those three states, the reason it's green is because these states have not been brought back into the Union yet. Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia do not have rights to vote in this presidential election. And the off-color grayish-green or tan colors are the territories. And the territories do not have the right to vote in this election either. So Ulysses S. Grant is elected president in 1868, and he'll serve as president from 1869 to 1877. He is the only person between Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt to serve two back-to-back terms in office after the Civil War. And to be fair, you can't even count you can't even really count Theodore Roosevelt, because one of those terms he was completing the term of William McKinley. In all actuality, he is the first president, or the only president, between Abraham Lincoln, who, by the way, did not serve two terms, well, hell, let's go back a minute. Actually, he's the only president, if you want to be really clear about it, he is the only president of the United States to have two full terms between Andrew Jackson from 1829 to 1837, and Woodrow Wilson from 1913 to 1921. Now, one of you is going to say, and I'm glad you're going to say it, I'm sure one of you's out there saying, wait a minute, whoa, what about Grover Cleveland? Good job, guys, good job. You're right, he served 2 terms in office, but remember they were non-consecutive terms in office. Grant is going to be probably the most powerful president that we're going to see between the 1830s and the 19 teens. And even he's not going to be really that powerful. He doesn't really want to be president. He kind of just wants the position. Now, who was Grant? Well, he was born in 1822. He was born in Ohio, and he was married to a woman by the name of Julia Dent. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter. His profession was a soldier. He did try for a while to be a businessman in between his stints in the Army, but it didn't go well. He ended up going bankrupt a couple of times. And his most important position before President of the United States was commanding general of the U.S. Army. He was commanding general of the U.S. Army from 1864 to 1869. During the 1868 election, you do have the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution passed. It's ratified and adopted on July 9th, 1868. And this says that citizens of the United States have the right to vote, and that right cannot be denied or altered by the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Essentially, it gives freed slaves the right to vote. Now, early in his term, President Grant is very concerned about black voting rights. And there's one major piece of legislation that he has passed called the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. And this is going right after the groups that are trying to suppress African American former slave civil and political rights. This action said that individuals who got involved by taking away civil and political rights of others was a federal crime. It allowed for the federal government to provide election supervision, especially in the South. It permitted martial law and the suspension of habeas corpus to combat the murder, assaults, and terroristic threatening of the Ku Klux Klan. And this was seen as the first major federal protection for African American rights. The only problem is it doesn't work. First of all, federal prosecutors do not use this very often. Only in Mississippi and South Carolina, this is the only 2 places that you see prosecutions. And the reason for this is the South isn't interested. The South still thinks that blacks are property, even if they're not allowed to own them anymore. And if you look at the Southern juries, even in those states, Mississippi and South Carolina, they refuse to convict members of the Ku Klux Klan. Only 35% of Klan members brought to trial actually see convictions. There's 3,310 cases, I believe, that are pursued by the federal government, and only about 1,143 or something around there are convictions. So only about 36%. They just aren't interested. They just are not interested in the protection of African American rights. Well, whether we want to or not, every 4 years we have to have a presidential election. And in 1872, President Grant will run for re-election against former U.S. Representative Horace Greeley. And Greeley is not only going to be a member of the Democratic Party, he's also going to try to run as a liberal Republican. And so this is going to be very confusing. In some states, he's going to run as a more liberal version of Grant. And in other states, he's going to run as a more conservative version of Grant. So in the South, he's going to run as a conservative, and in the North, he's going to run as a liberal. Now, remember, at this time, let me be clear, the Republican Party is the liberal party, not the Democratic Party. The party of Lincoln, the party of Grant, They're for African American rights. They're considered to be, here in 1860, 1870 time period, they're going to be the liberal party. The radical Republicans were the liberal Republicans. Lincoln was more of a moderate Republican. We would consider him a moderate Republican. Grant is kind of the same way. He's a moderate Republican. He doesn't want to do a lot of major changes. He kind of just wants to right the ship and get the country back afloat. We don't really know what Greeley really wanted to do. Greeley was very wishy-washy when it came to his politics. There were many things that he said he wanted to do, but no one really believed him. Oh, and by the way, he also died in the middle of the presidential election. He actually died between Election Day and the time that the Electoral College met, which created another problem because who is the Electoral College going to vote for? It really didn't matter, though, because Grant had enough electoral votes. He had 81% of the electoral votes, 286 votes. The question was what to do with Greeley's votes. Well, they split them amongst local Democrats because no one really knew what to do with them. So, like in Texas, the Texas candidate Jenkins won the 8 electoral votes. He also won a few in Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland. Same thing with Davis. Greeley did keep some of his electoral votes, even though he was dead. But I want you to look really closely at the red. Okay? The West, Oregon, Nevada, and California, they're traditionally Republican. They came into the Union under a Republican president. They've been pretty Republican. Look at the Northeast is pretty well Republican as well. The only state in the Northeast that's Democratic at this point is Maryland. Even Delaware, my home state, which is considered to be, at this point, a Democratic state, and by the way, today is still a Democratic state, it voted for Ulysses S. Grant. The only states that really vote for the Democrats at this point are Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Okay? And 2 of those states, Texas and Georgia, are still moderately under the control of the radical Republicans, yet they still end up leaning towards the Democrats. This tells you something. This tells you that Reconstruction politically is almost over. It's almost done, and the Democrats are taking back the South. Now, they didn't look at Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, the Carolinas, Virginia, and West Virginia. They haven't gotten those back, but I want you to pay close attention to the next election. Grant's second term in office was continued with Reconstruction. The first act is called the Amnesty Act of 1872, actually done after the election but before his second inaugural. This act pardoned many of the remaining rebels. Only about 500 people who were high-ranking Confederate military officers, government officials, were still banned from voting and holding public office. Otherwise, the majority of the ex-Confederate citizenry was brought back into the Union with no issue. The second thing that was passed during the second administration of Grant was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This will guarantee blacks equal accommodation in public places. This is watered down. The provisions are very, very watered down, and there was no way to enforce it. Congress had no provisions to enforce the act at all. And by 1883, the Supreme Court overturned this, saying that this was a states' rights issue, that only the states could guarantee blacks equal accommodation in public places. So you can see that the Grant administration is trying very hard, but but there are some limitations to what they're able to get through Congress and the court system. Now, the Supreme Court ruling the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional is actually interesting. We don't talk much about the Supreme Court during Reconstruction. We talk about Lincoln's, we talk about Johnson's, we talk about congressional Reconstruction, but we really don't talk about the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court was heavily involved with Reconstruction, and the book doesn't talk about it much, but I just kind of want to give you a basic idea as to what the courts were up to. Some of these cases are very important, they're interesting, and some of you may just enjoy them. The first is Ex parte Milligan, and it was done in 1866. There was a gentleman by the name of Lambden Milligan, and he had tried to get a group together to free Confederate prisoners of war during the Civil War and arm them and start the war over again, bring them back to the battlefront. And he is tried by a military tribunal. He is sentenced to death by hanging, and his lawyer sues to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that as a private citizen, he could not be tried by a military tribunal. And the Supreme Court in Ex parte Milligan orders him freed, orders the death sentence invalidated, and states clearly that military tribunals for citizens are unconstitutional. And the reason why is it violates trial by jury. Military tribunals do not have jury trials. They're done by a panel of judges. And that is a guaranteed right under the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, if you sign up for the U.S. military, if you are a member of the U.S. military, you give up this right to a trial by jury as part of your enlistment. This protection, Ex parte Milligan, only really protects U.S. citizens. It doesn't protect military officials. Officers and enlisted men in the military have to follow the military code or the military code of justice, but you can't use the military code of justice against the citizen population. Another issue was the slaughterhouse cases of 1873. In the state of Louisiana, in order to stop African Americans from owning their own businesses, the state said that they could now bar people from owning businesses. This was mainly to do with the butcher shops. A lot of African Americans were opening butcher shops, and so the state said that now you could only do it through slaughterhouses, large industrial slaughterhouses. And the Supreme Court did rule on the side of the state in this particular instance. They said that the state could bar people from owning businesses as long as their livelihood was not deprived. So as long as you could find work as a butcher, you were not guaranteed to own a business, and you were not guaranteed the right to own a business. As long as you could go work somewhere else. Now, today, that's kind of a ridiculous argument. Anybody can quit their job and start a business if they'd like to, as long as you can find the capital to back it and you have the idea. But this was a way of preventing former slaves from being able to own their own businesses in the state of Louisiana, and the courts sadly did side with the state of Louisiana on this. Bradwell v. Illinois, for you ladies out there, is a very important court case. The woman's name is Myra Bradwell. She was an attorney. She had gone to law school at a time when you didn't have to go to law school in order to become a lawyer. Back in the old days, you just read the law, is what it was called. You essentially studied the law. You took a test, the bar exam, and once you passed, you then became a lawyer. Well, Myra Bradwell actually went to law school. She sat for the bar exam. She passed. And then the only job she could find was as a secretary, a secretary in a law office. Well, she sued. She said that it was discrimination. She was being forced to be a secretary when people who didn't have law degrees were being allowed to practice law in the states because they were men. And today, of course, this is ridiculous. I mean, you wouldn't think of anyone with a college degree. I mean, my wife's a medical doctor. None of you, no offense, are going to be allowed to practice medicine because you're men, simply because you're a guy. You don't have a medical degree. You don't have a medical license. Well, what the Supreme Court said is that women did not have a legal basis to sue for discrimination in the workplace. Why? Because their traditional place was in the home. This is a very important court case because it sets the precedent that women didn't have legal rights in the workplace. That since their traditional place was a homemaker, as a wife and a mother, they didn't have the legal right to be in the workforce. If they chose to be in the workforce, they had to realize that that was at the discretion of men, and they had to essentially abide by the ruling of men. Now, Bradwell will eventually move on. She'll end up finding a law firm. She'll practice law. She'll be a very successful attorney, one of the first major female attorneys in U.S. history. But this is a major setback for women's rights in the 1800s. U.S. v. Cruikshanks, 1876. This was another issue. African Americans were being mistreated in the South. They were being hanged. They were being tortured. And the federal government decided that they were going to step in and protect African American rights. And they began passing a lot of those laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution did not give the federal government power to do that. It didn't give the federal government power to protect black rights. It said that the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave the states ultimate sovereignty, and therefore it was up to the states to decide what would go on. Now, this will essentially bring in the period that we refer to as Jim Crow. This will allow the states to pass laws that were illegal under federal law, but were validated by the Supreme Court. Finally was U.S. v. Reese. And you also had a situation here in the South where blacks were being prevented the right to vote. And you got to give the Southerners credit. When they were told that they couldn't take away the rights of African Americans to vote because of color of their skin, they found other ingenious ways of doing it. Grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes. And U.S. v. Reese actually reaffirmed that practice. It said that the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution did not guarantee citizens the right to vote. All the 15th Amendment did was list certain grounds that you could not deny suffrage. So the 15th Amendment says that you can't take away a person's right to vote because they're black or that they had previously been a slave, but that it doesn't protect them from other forms of having their constitutional right taken away, like the fact that they can't read or write, or the fact that they didn't have a grandfather that was eligible to vote at that time. So you can see that the courts are changing Reconstruction in many ways in a more conservative, less progressive way, so to speak. Things are being held back, especially when it comes to the implementation of the 14th and 15th Amendment. But if you look at the women's rights issue, Bradwell v. Illinois is very, very important in the case of women. So keep that in mind. These are not touched upon in the book, but they are very, very interesting and very, very important when you look at the overall scheme of things. Now, what is a grandfather clause? I mentioned it when we were talking about U.S. v. Reese. Well, what many of the southern states decided to do was pass laws that said if a person was descended from a grandfather who was not eligible to vote prior to the Reconstruction Act of 1867, no matter what their education, no matter the amount of property, it invalidated their right to vote. Now, why did they do this? Well, essentially what happens is this. After the Civil War, essentially all blacks were technically given the right to vote. And the South said, well, we can't have that, so what are we going to do? Well, since African Americans, since freed blacks were considered property, they didn't have any money, they weren't wealthy, there was a money tax put on them, a poll tax. Okay? Well, let's say some blacks were able to pay that poll tax. Well, what they decided to do was put an education requirement on voting. Well, what if that person was eligible by money and by education to vote? What do you do now? Well, a surefire way of making sure that no blacks were eligible to vote within the state was to pass a grandfather clause, because no black man, of course, remember, this does not pertain to women because women are not eligible to vote at this time. No black man in 1867 had a grandfather that was eligible to vote. Okay, they all were either considered slaves or freedmen living in the North with no voting rights. So this was another way to make sure that African Americans were not given the right to vote in the South. In 1876, we have another presidential election, and President Grant, although he toys with the idea of a third term, decides to keep the Washington principle, the precedent set by George Washington of serving only 2 terms. Now, let me be clear that there's nowhere written at this time that you have to only serve 2 terms. Washington himself never said that you should only serve 2 terms. Only he wanted to step down after 2 terms. But Grant decided that this was a good time for him to step aside here in 1877. And the Republicans decided to run Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. He was the governor of Ohio. He had served in the Civil War. His running mate was a guy by the name of William Wheeler. He was a U.S. representative. The Democrats decided that they would try to actually contest this election, really try to win it. And they run a New York pro-union Southern sympathizing governor by the name of Samuel J. Tilden, Samuel Jones Tilden. And for vice president, they nominate Thomas Hendricks, will be the vice presidential nominee. Now, as I said, Samuel J. Tilden has solid support in the southern states. He definitely follows a southern platform. But he's also got a very strong support in the northern states. Now, this is because he is running on a platform to end Reconstruction. The North is tired of Reconstruction. In many ways, they're tired of dealing with the South. They're tired of this nonsense of having to micromanage what goes on in the southern states. They're ready for this to be over with. And Tilden's running around the country saying, look, if you vote for me, I will end Reconstruction. So, you know, I will be the candidate that brings the country finally back together. Rutherford B. Hayes actually is the first Republican in a long time that has less support in the northern states than they had in any election before. He probably had the worst numbers since the 1856 presidential election. He does worse than 1860, 1864, 1868, and 1872. And many people, political observers and scholars, see this election as proof that the North is no longer interested in Reconstruction. They want it to be over with, and they're willing to get rid of the Republican Party and try the Democrats, which they have not elected since 1856. President Buchanan stepped down in 1861, and there hadn't been another Democrat since then. But there, other than maybe Johnson. Let's go back and say, remember, Johnson didn't get elected. He filled the term of Lincoln. But they had not chosen a Democrat since 1856. And yet they're toying with the idea of possibly bringing in a Democrat because Reconstruction has become so unpopular. Well, what happens? Well, in order to win in the Electoral College, you have to have a clear-cut majority. And what ends up happening is you have a 50-50 tie. In the popular vote, actually, Governor Tilden actually wins. He gets 51% of the vote. He gets 4.3 million votes, as opposed to Governor Hayes, who gets 48% of the vote and gets 4.0 million votes. So actually, he wins about 300,000 more votes than Hayes gets in the popular vote. But remember, again, the popular vote means absolutely nothing. Only the popular vote within the individual states means anything. And the problem is you have 3 contested states where there's a double set of electors. Now remember, in a presidential election, you don't vote, like if you're in Texas or Alabama like I am or Delaware, you don't vote for President of the United States. That's not really what you're voting for. You're voting for electors to go to the Electoral College and vote for you. So in the case of this map, Texas is voting for 8 electors for Samuel J. Tilden. Pennsylvania is voting for 29 electors that would go to Rutherford B. Hayes. So in 3 states, you're going to have dueling electors. Those 3 states are Florida, and it's 4 electoral votes, Louisiana, and it's 8 electoral votes, and South Carolina with its 7 electoral votes. In total, 19 electoral votes are at stake. Now, both the Democratic and Republican parties declare victory. There is a case to be made that the Democratic Party actually won these 3 states. Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina are very heavily Democratic states. We believe that there may have been some kind of voter suppression, aka hiding of ballots. There were some ballots that were mysteriously found days after the election. We'll never be sure, but we do know that this is a very, very interesting situation where we have 19 electoral votes, and there is no constitutional way to figure out where these electoral votes go. The Constitution talks about what happens if there's a tie in the Electoral College, but what happens if there's a tie in the state? Like the states can't decide who the electoral votes will go to. There is no constitutional provision for this, so no one knows exactly where this is going to go. So what is decided is that Congress is going to establish a 15-man committee, and they're going to kind of try to get to the end of the electoral dispute. And Congress at first tries to really, really make this seem like it's legit. 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats will be chosen, and then 1 independent, so that it looks like it's fair. Now, I just noticed a mistake on the PowerPoints. Please forgive me. It's actually President Grant. And what President Grant decides to do is he is going to make sure that he is not succeeded by a Democrat. So he will appoint the independent delegate. He'll give him a federal judgeship. And Congress will replace him with a Republican. So now you'll have 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And I bet you guys know exactly how this is going to go down. Every single time, the vote will be 8-7. Hayes should get the electors, the slate of 19 electoral votes in the Electoral College. Well, the House is ready to convene and declare Hayes the winner. The Democrats in the U.S. Senate threaten to filibuster. They say, this is not going to happen, we're not going to allow it. And to be honest with you, there is no provision, as I mentioned before. No one knows what to do. And they're afraid there's going to be a civil war over this, that the country will break out into war feeling that the election has been stolen. That the losing candidate, in this case, Rutherford B. Hayes, had stolen the election from the Democratic Party. So the question is what to do. And this is a painting of the Great Electoral Commission, or the United States Electoral Commission of 1876, which is, of course, convened to figure out this constitutional crisis. And it is a constitutional crisis because no one knows exactly how this is going to end. Well, the Republicans and the Democrats in the House and the Senate get together and they make a deal. And this deal is called the Compromise of 1877. And this is how Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the next president of the United States. Now, what will the Republicans give up in order to have the White House? Well, first, they will guarantee the removal of all federal troops from the southern states, except for military bases needed for national security. So, Reconstruction will come to an end. Number 2, Governor Hayes would appoint to his cabinet at least one Southern Democrat. He will bring in one Southern Democrat into his cabinet. 3, the federal government would begin construction of a second transcontinental railroad following the Southern Texas and Pacific route. We didn't talk about that here. The book talks about it, and you'll learn about the Homestead Act and the Railroad Act of 1862, which created the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, this is a second transcontinental railroad on the southern line. Remember that the northern line was essentially done because of the Civil War. It was chosen because the South had seceded. Now you'll have a second southern route for the Transcontinental Railroad. Finally, federal legislation would be passed to help industrialize the South. Remember, the South was an agricultural economy before the Civil War. It was devastated by the Civil War, and by the loss of the African slaves, the agricultural economy has not really recovered. Well, the Republicans promise that they will provide federal help to industrialize the South and help them recover, help them transform the agricultural economy into an industrial economy like the South. And this does happen, although you could argue it never really happens as well as it does in the North. Now, what do the Democrats promise in order to sell out Samuel J. Tilden? And there's no way to say this other than he was sold out. I mean, Tilden had the votes. He could have fought this forever and ever and ever. What did they do? What did they promise, to sell him out? Well, first they will peacefully accept Governor Hayes as long as the Republicans keep their promise as the next president of the United States, and they promise to respect black rights. This is playing lip service, of course. They have no intention of respecting black rights within the southern states, but they're going to make a good show of it, at least in the beginning stages of the 1877, 1878 time period. So that's it. The Compromise of 1877 brings to an end approximately 15 years of bloody Civil War and Reconstruction. It's now over. And what did we get from the Civil War and Reconstruction? Well, honestly, we talk about all the positives, but the reality of it is there's a lot of negatives. Sectionalism continues. Even to this day, North versus South, East versus West. The Civil War was supposed to destroy that. And it did to a point. Remember, before the Civil War, the phrase was the United States of America are. And now we talk about the United States of America is. We talk about one independent sovereign country versus so many independent sovereign states that are just oversaw by a federal government. We are strengthened, but sectionalism does continue. And you can argue it's still to this day. I live in the South. I live in Alabama. And, you're always hearing people talk about, well, them people up north and, blah, 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 blah. So, sectionalism does continue. You also see the executive branch weakened. The legislative branch is strengthened. The presidency, the prestige and power of the presidency is greatly reduced during this time, a time where we need one solid figurehead leader. The executive branch, the President of the United States, is greatly weakened by Reconstruction, the Johnson administration. So, we have that to look forward to in the upcoming weeks of looking at. Southern Democrats rejoice. Reconstruction's over. The North has won, but the victory is hollow in the fact that society has not been completely changed. Sure, that slavery is no longer allowed, but there are plenty of other ways of abusing and using the black citizens of the South. Southern blacks will grieve. Sure, they're no longer slaves, but at the same time, they have not been given the rights and privileges that they hoped that they would get with a victorious war. The Civil War is probably one of the major turning points. It is one of the major turning points in American history. If you've taken the first half of the course, you know that just how bloody and destructive it was. And, of course, we've talked about it here and, of course, your book reading. But, it failed to answer a lot of questions. It answered the slavery question. It answered the states' rights question to a point. But it didn't answer many of these other issues. So these are things that we're going to have to explore later in the week. Hopefully you all are reading your textbook, you're doing your discussions. And if you have any questions, please let me know. If you have any questions about the slides, please let me know. Remember, these are not mandatory. They are optional to help supplement what you've learned through the reading. I hope you enjoyed them. Please give me some feedback if you have any feedback. Now, some people will probably say, why is almost everything spelled out on the slides? Remember, due to ADA accommodations, anything that's said has to pretty much be on the slide. So that's why if people are wondering why the slide is not like you'd normally do a PowerPoint slide in a presentation, that's why. If anybody has any questions, give me a call, give me an email. Have a good rest of the week. Get up with me. If not, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.